Australia has a strange problem that most countries would envy. At the same time that towns run out of water, vast amounts of fresh water are being washed straight into the ocean. During northern wet seasons, entire river systems flood so heavily that billions of liters flow unused into the sea, while thousands of kilometers inland, land lies dry enough to crack open. That contradiction is not new, and it is not theoretical. It has been measured, debated, and argued over for generations. And it is the reason Australia keeps returning to one of the most audacious ideas ever proposed on this continent, deliberately flooding part of its own desert. I spent time digging into why this idea keeps resurfacing, and what stood out wasn't how radical it sounded, but how consistently it returned whenever Australia faced pressure. Engineers, governments, and scientists have all revisited it, not as fantasy, but as a response to a structural problem the country has never solved. Australia is the driest inhabited continent on Earth, receiving on average less than 500 millimeters of rainfall a year, much of it highly variable. Nearly 70% of Australians live along the coast because that is where almost all reliable water infrastructure exists. Inland, rainfall drops sharply, summer temperatures regularly exceed 40 degrees, and evaporation rates can remove more water annually than most rivers deliver. The economic cost of this imbalance is substantial. Agriculture depends heavily on a handful of river systems, particularly the Murray-Darling Basin, which alone supports around 40% of Australia's agricultural output. When drought hits, food production contracts, rural economies suffer, and water becomes a political crisis. The outback spans millions of square kilometers, much of it underused, not because the land lacks potential, but because water never stays long enough to sustain settlement or farming. This is why planners keep returning to the same question. What if water could be made to stay? As early as the 1930s, a man named John Bradfield, best known for designing the Sydney Harbour Bridge, argued that Australia was mismanaging its geography. Okay, that was bold at the time. He questioned the management skills and policies of the authorities. But people knew this was a centuries-old problem that needed solving, and he had a solution, so they listened. Bradfield stressed that northern rivers flooded too violently, while the interior was left dry. His solution was not modest. He proposed diverting floodwaters from northern Queensland inland through an enormous system of canals, tunnels, and dams, sending water toward Australia's lowest natural basin, Lake Eyre. And there was a reason he specifically brought up Lake Eyre. Lake Eyre sits about 15 meters below sea level. When rare floods reach it, the transformation is immediate and dramatic. The lake can spread across nearly 10,000 square kilometers, becoming Australia's largest body of water. Birds arrive in huge numbers, fish breed rapidly, vegetation spreads across what was previously bare ground, and surrounding regions often experience increased rainfall. Bradfield believed that if this flooding could be made permanent, the effects would be profound. A stable inland sea, he argued, could moderate temperatures, alter rainfall patterns, generate hydroelectric power, and support agriculture on a scale comparable to major farming regions overseas. During the Great Depression, the idea attracted serious political attention. It promised employment, food security, and national development. And for a moment, everyone thought this was the solution they had been looking for. But once detailed studies began, enthusiasm collided with reality. There was not just one problem, there was a list. The first problem was evaporation. In Central Australia, water loss is extreme. Studies suggested that a large inland lake could lose up to 3 meters of depth every year purely to heat and wind. Any system feeding it would need to replace that loss continuously, year after year, without interruption. That was a scale of effort almost unimaginable. The second problem was volume. Even Australia's largest northern rivers, like the Burdekin and Tully, carry an average annual flow that is insufficient to sustain a permanent inland sea. The floods are dramatic, delivering billions of liters of water in days, but they are episodic. The supply is irregular, while evaporation is relentless. Then there was salinity. Much of the interior contains naturally salty soils. Flooding the basin without an outlet would cause salt to accumulate steadily, eventually turning the water hostile to both agriculture and most forms of life. By the 1940s, Bradfield's original scheme was shelved, not because it lacked vision, but because physics refused to cooperate. What sounded extremely intelligent on paper became unrealistic once the calculations were done. And if that was not enough, international disasters like the collapse of the Aral Sea after large-scale river diversion showed how risky it is to tamper with water systems without knowing the long-term consequences. And so, Australia was back to square one. A vast interior remained dry as desert, untouched and unforgiving. And yet, the idea never truly disappeared. There had been occasions in the past that continued reminding the country of the dire need for an inland sea. Over the past 2 decades, droughts across Australia have become more frequent and more severe. From 2001 to 2020, the country experienced the driest 20-year period on record, with some regions seeing rainfall decline by up to 20%. That is truly alarming. Water restrictions are no longer just an inconvenience. They have become political flashpoints, shaping elections and policy debates. At the same time, global food demand has skyrocketed, particularly across Asia. Countries like China and India alone account for nearly 40% of the world's agricultural import growth, creating enormous pressure on nations with stable land, water, and infrastructure. Influential figures have repeatedly pointed out that Australia's interior, if watered, could theoretically produce millions of tons of additional crops, positioning the nation as a key player in feeding the region. This combination of worsening droughts, rising demand, and the allure of untapped land has kept the inland sea dream alive. And how can we forget the impact of technological advancements over the last decade? Modern technology gives the impression that solutions are finally within reach. Advances in hydrological modeling, satellite monitoring, and renewable energy have led some engineers and policymakers to believe that pumping water hundreds of kilometers inland, or even using desalinated seawater, could succeed where past efforts failed. And here is exactly where they are focusing all their energy. They are solving the problems that hampered previous models. Updated proposals now emphasize selective water capture, maximizing efficiency, and in some cases pumping seawater inland using solar or wind-powered systems. Supporters argue that stabilizing a large inland lake could moderate drought cycles, increase rainfall by measurable margins, and unlock millions of hectares of currently unusable land. But what is a dream without challenges? These modern proposals still face enormous obstacles. Water would need to travel over 1,500 kilometers from northern rivers to Lake Eyre, roughly the same distance as moving water from London to Rome. Hundreds of kilometers of canals, tunnels through hard terrain, and pumping stations capable of moving tens of billions of liters per year would be required. Even the most conservative cost estimates place the project at tens to hundreds of billions of dollars, rivaling Australia's most ambitious infrastructure projects, including the National Broadband Network. Engineering is only part of the story. In discussions of engineering and hydrology, it is easy to overlook the ecosystem. Diverting rivers changes coastal ecosystems that depend on seasonal flows. Fisheries, wetlands, and marine habitats downstream would all be affected if floodwaters were intercepted before reaching the sea. And what if I tell you there is an ethical dimension as well? Flooding Lake Eyre permanently would transform land that holds deep cultural significance for Aboriginal communities, for whom the basin is not empty space, but a living landscape tied to law, history, and identity. This is where the debate becomes uncomfortable. The question is no longer simply whether Australia can drown part of its desert, but whether it should, and who gets to decide what progress looks like. Economically, the outcome is uncertain. There is no guarantee that agriculture would scale as predicted, or that the climate effects would be both beneficial and stable. So will Australia ever drown its desert? Probably not in the way early planners imagined. But as water scarcity intensifies, the pressure to attempt bold solutions will only grow. Perhaps the question is not simply whether this project is possible. Maybe it is about why Australians, time and again, feel compelled to tame the interior, to take on a challenge that seems bigger than us, to rewrite the story of a desert that has, for centuries, refused to bend. And that, more than anything, explains why this idea keeps resurfacing.